The hopes in the Russian army have melted to such a degree that the Russian soldiers are explaining that they do not even want to go to the front. It is understandable that civilians do not want to go to the front, but the fact that even the strongest troops in Russia's Kaliningrad region do not want to step into the Death Valley in Ukraine means the destruction of the Russian army. Let's examine the collapse of the Russian army together. Later, we will examine in detail why the Russian soldiers refuse to go to the front and the reflections of this event. Ukrainian and Russian forces are engaged in heavy fighting on many front lines in eastern. The Kremlin government is ready to sacrifice large numbers of Russian soldiers to hold the Donbass region. Ukrainian forces respond to any attack by the Russians trying to gain an advantage with these attacks. The Russian forces had to return to their defensive positions with great losses. At many points, even if the Kremlin government does not disclose it, the news of many casualties from the front demoralizes all the soldiers in the Russian soldiers on Ukrainian soil find it difficult to concentrate on the war due to the news of casualties. It is not only the Russian soldiers in Ukraine who are affected by the harsh conditions of the war. At the same time, even the soldiers in the military training centers in many regions of Russia are deeply affected by the news of these losses and the harsh conditions. Riots in Russian military training camps are highly probable. Russian soldiers in every inch of the territory of the Russian Federation are hopeless and demoralized. The demoralized and hopeless Russian soldiers trigger riots against the Kremlin government. Russia needs a large number of military manpower to continue its invasion campaigns in eastern Ukraine. For this reason, under the name of mobilization, Russian citizens are quietly included in the Russian army. Soldiers mobilized in Kaliningrad, Russia's far-flung land, refused to go to war on Ukrainian soil, describing what happened in eastern Ukraine, especially in the Donetsk region, as a massacre. The soldiers from Kaliningrad do not want to die in the war. That started with the personal ambitions of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. The mobilized soldiers from Kaliningrad conveyed their demands not to go to Ukraine by sending a video to Kaliningrad Governor Anton of Russian leader Vladimir Putin directed the soldiers mobilized in Kaliningrad to the region to be used in offensive activities on the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic, recognized by Russia. However, as stated by the soldiers in the Russian soldiers at the training center in Kaliningrad were trained in territorial defense. The use of these soldiers in offensive activity will not gain the Russian army anything. Russian soldiers mobilized from Kaliningrad, after completing their training on territorial defense, were sent to the Donetsk region in a frivolous way. The role of these soldiers on the battlefield has been changed to storm troops, and the command of the pro-Russian separatist troops was transferred to his sub. The mobilized soldiers became even more pessimistic due to the bad events that took place the previous day. A very bloody clash took place the other day between the Ukrainian border guards and the Russian stormtroopers. Russian forces wanted to break through the Ukrainian defense lines in the direction of Bakhmut. Russian forces deployed to a building in the area to break through the defensive line. The Russian storm unit began reconnaissance with the drone to locate the Ukrainian forces, but the drone was tracked and neutralized by the Ukrainian forces. After the unmanned aerial vehicle was neutralized, the Ukrainian forces identified the building where the Russian troops were located and started maneuvering fire. At the same time, air support was provided with mortars, along with the Ukrainian forces. The Russian stormtroopers dispersed into the surrounding buildings due to the heavy attack by the Ukrainian forces. The Russian forces were more numerous than the Ukrainian troops, but after the heavy attack of the Ukrainian forces, the numerical superiority of the Russian forces was. The Russian forces had to retreat from their current position with heavy losses as a result of the Ukrainian attacks. After this conflict, the Russian stormtroopers lost 9 soldiers and returned to the Russian ranks with 20 wounded influenced by this incident. The mobilized soldiers from Kaliningrad reported to the governor of Kaliningrad in the video that there were losses in their battalions and there was no communication. Soldiers from Kaliningrad stated that they were literally sent to slaughter. Soldiers from Kaliningrad think they are just like artillery shells on Ukrainian. However, this was not the case only for soldiers from Kaliningrad. Every Russian army member in Ukraine felt this way. All Russian soldiers mobilized and sent to Ukrainian territory feel the same way, and they reflect these feelings to the new demobilized soldiers at the training center. Russian soldiers in the training centers are resisting not to be sent to the Donetsk region, increasing the size of the revolts day by. Soldiers of a dispersed unit of the Russian army in the Donetsk region stated that they survived under very difficult conditions. The only wish of the soldiers who are not affiliated with any unit at the moment is to return to their homes and families in the territory of the Russian Federation. Soldiers mobilized mobilized from the Novus Abus region stated that they were deployed in offensive activities, although they received defensive training, as did the mobilized soldiers from the Kilin and Grad region. Soldiers mobilized from the Novi Sub-Berk region stated that given the situation on the battlefield, military training was unnecessary. Soldiers who were mobilized and sent to the territory of Ukraine frequently broadcast such videos, especially after the start of the counterattack of the Ukrainian forces. The pleas of the mobilized soldiers. Hearing these pleas, the soldiers in the military training camps carried out revolts against the Russian commanders in order not to be sent to Ukraine. Recently, mobilized soldiers set fire to the training camps or tried to leave the training camp as a unit in some Russian training camps where there was no revolt. The soldiers' endurance level decreased a lot. I described the soldiers whose level of endurance has decreased as bombs ready to explode with a spark. Large-scale riots could begin in all Russian training. The Kremlin government will again ignite the wick of the uprising in all Russian training camps. For some time now, the Kremlin government has been trying to impose a new wave of mobilization on the Russian people. Russian forces are losing more and more soldiers every day, and with each passing day, a new wave of mobilization is approaching. However, with this mobilization wave, it is certain that there will be uprisings that the Kremlin government cannot. When we look at the attitude of the Russian people towards the Kremlin and the war after the mobilization decision, it is not necessary to be a prophet to know that Russia will be dragged into a great chaos with the second wave. It is also necessary to make a general comment on the course of the war, as President Joe Biden said earlier this month. A year after the invasion, he claimed that Putin had already lost in Ukraine. However, these evaluations are based on the relative strength of the resistance of Ukraine and the blocs that support it, especially, and military officials have stressed whatever the outcome in Ukraine, Russia's invasion has made it a fragmented military force that will require years of restructuring to recover from the devastating effect of the invasion. However, Pentagon official Colin Cole's latest assessment of the House Armed Services Committee investigation into the accountability of billions of dollars in USA to Ukraine represents an evolution in these assess. Russia has not only done lasting damage to itself, but has declared that it is no longer capable of achieving any of the goals Putin has set for himself in Ukraine. The new assessment comes at an important time for Ukraine, perhaps the most critical since Russia's first invasion on February 24th last year. While the Allies, especially the United States, are trying to support the war from their own internal audience, they're also considering changing the rules of the game. There are new armed shipments that can improve Ukraine's chances without provoking Russia into a wider. Putin's ambition to invade Ukraine seems to center around the assumption that Western support for the former Soviet nation will eventually dwindle and fade, and by that time he has at his disposal enough young Russian men to send in arms. However, considering the situation these Russian men are in, we can say that a great chaos has come. This chaos will hit Russia. Every chaos brings with it a new order. There is no place for the current Kremlin government in the new order that chaos will bring with it in Russia, where there are anti-war actions every day. Next Intel just updated. Ukraine has been continuing its struggle for total independence and territorial integrity against the Russians for a year. The Kiev army, which had very few soldiers in the beginning of the war, managed to increase the number of personnel every day. Men and women living in Ukraine joined the Ukrainian army without. This example of self-sacrifice watched with admiration by the whole world has almost set a model for the armies of most all states. In the face of this, Vladimir Putin began to deport soldiers to the front by forcibly recruiting with the mobilization orders he poured out from the Kremlin. Putin's helplessness has reached such a great point that there has been a report that some Russian female soldiers have been deported to the front since the beginning of the war. The angels who joined the Ukrainian army contributed a lot in turning the tide of the war in favor of the care of government. Yes, we are talking about heroic female volunteers in the Ukrainian army. These brave warriors, each of whom joined the Kiev army of her own free will of fighting fearlessly against the Russian. Since the invasion of Ukraine, the number of women volunteering in the army has increased. According to military officials, about 60,000 women serving the Ukrainian armed forces in combat and non-combat roles. About 10,000 of these are now either on the front lines of the war or in jobs that could send them to the front lines before the invasion. However, there were about 32,000 women in the Ukrainian military service is optional for women in Ukraine, but the government is considering making it compulsory for women with certain skills. But the Kiev government has announced that a decision on this issue will not be made until next year. The Kremlin, on the other hand, had to send women to the front in order to fill its troop shortage. Against this decision, Russia's military deficit at the front has reached such a level that they do not care about ethical values anymore. Putin compels his staff to make some decision. In Ukraine, the situation is moving in the the opposite direction. As of 2021, the Ukrainian army had 196,600 soldiers. When the war began, the Ukrainian army had around 230,000 soldiers, and 22% of this were female soldiers. Now the Ukrainian army consists of about 750,000 soldiers. The Ukrainian armed forces have evolved over the past 9 months and have been able to recruit more than 700,000 personnel, including Ukrainian and international volunteer fighters, local defense forces, police forces, and all security law enforcement element. In this process, Ukrainian women continue to join the army, along with about 60,000 professional female soldiers in the Ukrainian. There are around 60,000 new volunteer female soldiers joining the army. In total, around 120,000 Ukrainian female soldiers support the Ukrainian armed forces in every field. Many of these soldiers take part in behind-the-line missions. As we have just mentioned, around 10,000 participate in active combat missions on the front line. Women in the Ukrainian army include snipers, elite, paratroopers, special operations units. Women soldiers specialize in areas such as reconnaissance and sabotage, close combat intelligence, and medics. In addition, hundreds of high-ranking female commanders are actively fighting against the Russians in the Ukrainian army. The Russian army was many times superior to Ukraine in terms of both equipment and soldiers, but the soldiers of Kiev army managed to defeat the Russian army thanks to their extraordinary war genius strategies and their faith in Ukrainian women who aim to make Ukraine livable for their freedom, husbands, and children, and to make the Ukrainian armed forces even stronger, accelerate their direct participation in the Kiev army without feeling any obligation on the Russian side. This process is a little more painful. Mobilized Russian citizens who join the Russian army at the insistence of the Moscow adminis are forcibly centered on the territory of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian government does not have such an aggressive and thoughtless war policy. Perhaps the secret to the resistance of the Kiev army against the Russian armed forces. It's the absence of any coercive factors in Ukrainian army. As Russia's occupation continues, Ukrainian lawmakers have revised an existing law that could require women aged 18 to 60 who are eligible for military service and working in certain occupations to serve in the Ukrainian army during the war. Mandatory military service for Ukrainian has been expanded to include a large number of qualified professions for compulsory registration, including librarians, journalists, musicians, and psychologists. The conscription of women in Ukraine is nothing new, and women have served in the army since 1993 after Kiev gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Not all enlisted female soldiers will see the front lines, as many Ukrainian women have traditionally helped with logistical. When Russia first invaded the Donbas region in 2014, 257 Ukrainian women were awarded for their combat service, and 9 Ukrainian women were awarded posthumously, according to advocacy organizations. Security Women, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Malia, explained that not a single woman has been forcibly mobilized since 2014, despite her ability to recruit women during a video in which an elderly woman said it was the world's fault for hating us because of Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine went viral and has been viewed more than 210,000 times. A Russian woman told the journalist, "I am 82 years old, but I can't look at what our country has become. The whole world hates us now just because of this gold. Forgive me, Putin is war. He cannot stay in power without." He added that he wrote a letter accusing Putin of flags, stealing, and war. Tens of thousands of people, including Ukrainian citizens, have doubted since Putin launched the invasion. Russians critical of Putin and the Ukraine war could face up to 15 years in prison. Under the law introduced earlier last year, words like war and invasion were banned as a way of describing what Putin called the special military operat. 20-year-old college student Les Soba was placed under house arrest for posting anti-war posts on social media, including about the explosion on the bridge connecting Russia to annex Crimea here in October. She has been accused of justifying terrorism and discrediting the Russian military and is facing up to 10 years in prison. Currently, the most up-to-date reports of the UK-Ukraine military are published. When the war began, Ukraine had about 196,600 active military personnel and 900,000 reservists according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Now, the active military personnel in the Ukrainian army has exceeded 700,000 in its most recent form. One of the important reasons behind this increase in the army was the added participation of Russia's conflict with Ukraine, the two main suppliers of both energy and food and fertilizer commodities, has caused supply disruption for both developing and developed countries. The most fundamental change was Europe's shift away from dependence on Russian gas. It is thought that Europe will never return to a meaningful dependence on Russian fossil fuels, even if the war ends tomorrow. Trust between European consumers and their primary suppliers has been. In other words, Russia is taking heavy blows from every angle. However, even in Moscow, Russian women, soldiers, can cause a serious indignation at the front.